Hi everyone, Ian here from the Media Center, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the Blackmagic Pocket 4K cinema camera. The Blackmagic Pocket 4K is a micro four thirds camera which holds approximately 13 stops of dynamic range and captures up to a 4K resolution at 60 frames per second and a 2K and 1080p resolution up to 120 frames a second, all internally in varying degrees of ProRes 422 10-bit and Blackmagic RAW 12-bit. The Pocket 4K uses a lightweight carbon fiber chassis, which has a simple button layout, a large 5-inch touchscreen, and an excellent UI interface, making the camera incredibly easy to use from the moment you pick it up. We've paired the Blackmagic with a small rig cage, which protects the camera and allows additional mounting points for various accessories. And the camera comes fully rigged straight out of the bag. On top, we have a blind spot power junkie, which is our external power solution, and this connects via a ball head to the cage's cold shoe mount. The dummy battery will sit inside the camera's grip, and its cable will run alongside the cage frame and should connect to the blind spot unit. This external solution allows you to connect Sony MPF batteries, which should provide approximately 90 minutes of power per battery, and 3 are included in the bag. The top handle provides a good grip and holds 2 additional cold shoe mounts for adding additional peripherals, such as a monitor or wireless audio transmitters. The wooden side handle brings additional stability and ease of use to the camera, but also provides a unique mounting solution for our external recording media, of which you have 1 terabyte of SSD. This connects through the top of the handle via the USB-C, and the drive can be inserted and removed from the handle by loosening the side locking screw and sliding the secondary safety latch on the underside of the handle to one side. The SSD will then slide out from underneath. The USB-C cable from the SSD needs to be connected to the camera's USB-C input located at the side of the camera body. Within this area, you'll also have a 3.5mm jack, a headphone jack, a full-size HDMI, a 12-volt mains power input, and a mini XLR input. Both handles are seated to the cage via Nato locks, which provide a strong and secure locking point. These can be loosened via a screw and adjusted if required. As good practice, check these are secure and tightened when first removing the camera from the bag, to avoid the camera sliding off the mount and potentially being damaged. Due to the data rates and quality of the codecs available, we'd always recommend using the external SSD as your primary recording media whenever possible. If you require internal storage, the camera houses 1 UHS-2 SD card and 1 CFast 2.0 card, both of which are 64GB in capacity. These are located inside the camera's built-in grip. Please note that if you decide to capture onto the internal CFast card, this is a 2.0 variant, and these cannot fit into or transfer data onto regular CFast readers. Rest assured, a 2.0 reader is supplied in the camera bag. Finally, the camera comes with an EF Metabones speed booster, which allows you to use Canon lenses and converts the micro four thirds sensor to approximately a super 35mm equivalent. This will increase low light performance and provide a wider field of view. Additional items in the bag include your second and third battery, a dual battery charger with a mains power supply, a sun hood, a variable 1 to 5 stop ND filter, step-up rings, a waterproof camera bag, and a cable pouch which holds 1 mini XLR to XLR adapter, 1 CFast 2.0 card reader and cable, 1 USB 3.0 to USB-C cable for the SSD, and a USB 2.0 to USB-C, which can be used with the blind spot power junkie for external power banks. The power button is located at the top right-hand side of the camera body, and when turning it on, you'll be met with an excellent 5-inch touch display. Along the top panel, you'll also be met with a series of functions. Starting from the left and moving to the right, you'll have the exposure guide menu, frame rate, shutter, aperture, timecode, ISO, white balance, and battery life. Along the bottom, you'll have a histogram, a record button, your recording media, and audio levels. Certain icon areas can be altered to showcase different parameters, and we'll cover this as we go through the menu. Each area is touch enabled, and selecting a control allows you to tap and toggle or scrub through and adjust the dedicated settings. Many of these settings will also allow for an automatic function to be enabled. However, we'd advise against this. To exit any icon, simply tap on an open area of the screen and you'll be returned to the default display. If you wish to hide screen icons for a clean output, swipe up or down on the display. To bring the information back, do the same thing again. In addition to the display icons, you can adjust the core exposure parameters via the camera's physical buttons from the front and top of the camera grip, these being the aperture, shutter, ISO, and white balance. When setting the white balance, a variety of presets will appear. Selecting the CWB tab will provide a Kelvin adjustment scale in which you can manually alter in 100 Kelvin increments. Or if you wish to use a white card, selecting ATW will insert a square overlay across the center of the screen. If ATW is chosen, ensure your white or gray card covers the total diameter of the overlay and tap the Update WB. This will perform an automatic white balance and set the temperature of the scene based on the lights you're using. Quick presets are also available for some common lighting environments. Notably, bright sunlight, which is set to 5600 Kelvin, incandescent bulbs at 3200, fluorescent bulbs at 4000 Kelvin, mixed light at 4500, and finally cloud at 6500. The Pocket 4K doesn't have built-in ND filters, so you'll need to use the 1 to 5 stop Polar Pro variable ND, which comes supplied in the bag. This is an 82mm thread and can be attached to the majority of our lenses in the media center via the step-up rings, which are also included in the bag. Step-up rings allow us to increase or decrease the thread size between the front of the lens and the back of an adapter. To format your media, use the LCD icon and 2 card slots will appear in the recording window. If you have the external SSD connected, this will appear in slot 2 and the SD card will be automatically disabled. The additional slot will continue to use the CFast 2.0 card, and if any of your media is locked, a padlock icon will be visible. Each card slot will show its storage capacity, how much has already been used, its remaining record time, and the media's format. You have 2 formats to choose from: OS X Extended, which is designed for Mac, and exFAT, which can be used across both Mac and Windows hardware. This choice will be entirely dependent on the type of computer you're editing on. If you're a dedicated Mac editor, use OS X Extended. For a Windows-only user, or someone who may be transferring their media across both Mac and Windows hardware, use exFAT. When formatting, you'll be taken through a couple of screen menus and simply need to follow the directions stated. Once completed, to move back to your default display, press the Exit tab. In addition to the core exposure settings across the display, you also have a record button, which, as you would expect, records the image, audio levels, and a frame per second button, which allows you to set the project frame rate, i.e. what frame rate will the footage be played back in. It's worth noting that due to the Pocket 4K using a third-party power adapter, you'll often notice that the battery indicator suggests there is very little charge left even if your battery is fully charged. This is simply because the camera isn't able to correctly display the true battery levels. Because of this, we recommend going off the LED indicators on the MPF batteries of the PowerJunkie adapter. This will give you a truer representation of how much charge is left. The physical record button is also accessible at the front of the hand grip. To view any recorded media, use the playback button and use the touchscreen icons to start, stop, and move through the playback interface. Note, when monitoring guides such as false color or zebras are enabled in camera, they will also be displayed on playback. Rest assured, they're just an overlay and won't burn into the files. To exit playback, press the record button. The detailed audio levels provide a great visual context for your audio signal and also allow adjustments to be made quickly while having a live view of the scene. The FPS refers to the project frame rate, i.e. what frame rate will your finished project be edited in. When recording regular motion, this will likely be set to either 25 frames or 24 frames in the UK. Within the FPS window, you'll also see an option to enable off-speed recording. Selecting this will provide a higher frame rate for slow motion capture. The frame rates available will be entirely dependent on the resolution, codec, and sensor size you're using. These additional parameters can also be set in the internal menu or from the HFR button. Whatever the off-speed frame rate is set to, this will be remapped in camera to the project frame rate, and this will bake in the slow motion. For example, 25/50 means the camera will capture the image at 50 frames a second and will then reinterpolate it as 25, thus slowing it down. The final icon, which is incredibly useful, is the exposure, focus, and grid guide. Tapping here presents 5 quick access tools. You'll have the ability to set zebras, enable focus peaking at different strengths, switch between a variety of common aspect ratios, overlay composition tools such as rule of thirds, crosshairs, the center dot, a leveler, and safety zones, and finally you'll have the ability to enable and disable false color. When focusing, you can magnify the image by pressing the magnifier button at the back of the camera body or by double tapping the center of the LCD panel. This magnification is touch sensitive, meaning you can quickly focus across different areas of the frame. The false color overlay is an excellent tool for gauging exposure, and Blackmagic uses dedicated colors to always represent specific light values. Purple suggests you're losing black detail, meaning these areas are extremely dark and crushed. Blue means you're nearly losing black detail, so this would represent very dark shadows. Green represents middle grey, and this should sit at approximately 38.4% on the IRE scale. Pink represents one stop above middle grey, which is normally where Caucasian skin tones sit, and this will be at approximately 45 to 48% on the IRE scale. Yellow represents when the white point is nearly clipping at 80%, and red represents when white has clipped at 95%. The various shades of grey in between represent additional light levels. For example, the darker shades of grey represent the additional shadow regions, and the brighter shades of grey represent the additional mid-tone, white point, and highlight regions. As a side note, it's worth keeping in mind that each of these different colours represents a varying percentage on the IRE scale. For example, green represents middle grey at 38%, but as you can see on Blackmagic's official chart, it has a bit of wiggle room on either side. An important area of the Pocket 4K is its dual native ISO. This relates to the camera having 2 separate circuits connected to the sensor, which can switch between 2 native settings, allowing the image to retain a large dynamic range and low noise signal at both a lower and higher ISO sensitivity. Within each circuit lies a set of ISO ranges. In the lower circuit, this moves from 100 to 1000 ISO, with the native being 400. In the higher circuit, this range moves from 1250 to 6400 ISO, with the native being 3200. The idea is that in theory, you can set your camera at either 400 or 3200, which is a 3-stop difference, and the dynamic range and noise will be very similar. However, 3200 will always have a little bit more noise and a little bit less dynamic range. This feature is allowing filmmakers more flexibility across various lighting situations. However, because of the way in which dual ISO works, one can easily miscalculate which ISO is best optimized for certain scenarios. So let's break it down. The key to correctly choosing an ISO within the dual native system is understanding how many stops below and above middle grey are captured at each ISO value. When we look at Blackmagic's official chart, we can see each value has a middle grey point, represented by a horizontal line. The dark yellow region shows the number of stops available below middle grey in the shadows, while the lighter yellow region shows the number of stops available above middle grey in the midtones and highlights. Now, each ISO has around 12 to 13 stops. However, how those stops are distributed is different. For example, at ISO 400, we can see it has 7.6 stops available to capture in the shadows and 5.5 stops in the midtones and highlights. By contrast, ISO 100 has 9.6 stops in the shadows, but only 3.5 in the highlights. This differentiation is extremely important because the more stops of light you have available in the shadows, the less noise and grain will be visible. And by contrast, the more stops you have available above middle grey, the more information and detail you can capture in the highlights before clipping occurs. By comparing the two ISOs I just referenced, we can assert that ISO 100 will have less noise in the shadows due to its 9.6 stops, but will be extremely limited in its highlights at 3.5, meaning the image would clip and lose information very quickly if we were filming on a bright, sunny day. ISO 400, however, is more center-weighted, providing a decent range in the shadows at 7.6 stops, which should still mitigate most of the noise in the shadows, but can hold nearly 2 more stops in the highlights at 5.5, meaning the image will not clip as fast in brighter conditions. An interesting part of the dual native system is what happens across the ISO values when you switch from the low circuit to the higher circuit. When moving from 1000 ISO, the final value in the lower circuit, to 1250, the first value in the second circuit, we can see the dynamic range shifts drastically above and below middle grey. We quickly move from having 6.8 stops of light in the highlights at 1000 to 3.8 at 1250, a huge 3-stop difference. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, if we take this example of moving clouds on a sunny day, we can see the image shifts between a well-exposed frame, which captures lots of detail at 1000, to a completely blown out clip at 1250. Even if we compensate for the ISO change by stopping down the aperture, the image still can't retain all of the detail. However, when we go up to 3200 ISO, which is the native ISO for the second circuit, which holds 5.1 stops in the highlight, all of a sudden we can see the highlight detail returns. So although the ISO has more than doubled, it retains more information above middle grey. This is completely different to the single ISO circuits we've used for decades, which assume the higher you increase the ISO range, the weaker your dynamic range becomes. Because of this drastic change in where stops of light sit across each ISO, it's incredibly important to take stock of which one should be used in which environment. If you're shooting in a scenario where you require good dynamic range across both the shadows and highlights, use the native ISO of 400. 400 will also produce the most evenly balanced dynamic range across the shadows and highlights in the first circuit. This should always be your starting point. If you can open the aperture or add more light to the scene, this should be done first before increasing the ISO. If you require some additional dynamic range in the highlights and there's not as many shadows, go between 500 to 640 ISO. If you require lots of dynamic range in the highlights and have very few shadows to capture, ISO 800 to 1000 is acceptable. However, remember, shadows may produce more noise at this range in comparison to ISO 400. It's also worth noting that if you decide to use bright ISO ranges like 800 to 1000 and you decide to shoot outside with an open aperture, ND filters will almost certainly be required. If you require more dynamic range in the shadows, for example, you're shooting at night or in lower lit environments, then 1250 to 3200 ISO would be better suited. And again, 3200 will give you the most balanced dynamic range in the second circuit, and 1000 to 2500 will provide more detail in the shadows, but less in the highlights. Now that's covered, it's time to jump into the menu, and in my opinion, Blackmagic by far have the best menu UI of any camera. To access settings, press the menu button. On the record window, we have 3 pages, all accessible by using the left and right touch arrows. Page 1 allows you to set your resolution and codec. You have the option to record DCI 4K, Ultra HD 4K, or 1080p across both ProRes and Blackmagic RAW. With ProRes, you get multiple flavors, and we'd recommend the HQ version if you require the highest quality and have enough card space. If you're low on card space, 422 is also a good option, and both of these codecs subsample at 422 10-bit. If you require a 12-bit file, wish to obtain a higher quality, or want more adjustability in post-production, then Blackmagic RAW is an excellent codec to work with, especially when paired with DaVinci Resolve. Unlike many RAW files, Blackmagic RAW moves part of the demosaicing process into the camera, reducing the CPU workload in the computer. This provides a more efficient processor-friendly workflow, which is quicker for real-time playback, while still keeping many of the advantages which regular RAW files provide. Within the codec, you have 2 types of recording options: constant bitrate and constant quality. Bitrate means it will be a consistent number regardless of how much detail and information appears in the image. And for this, you can set different compression, ranging from 3.1 to 12:1. 3:1 is designed for feature film and commercial work, 5:1 for independent film and high-end television, and 8:1 and 12:1 are designed to produce the smallest file size suitable for broadcast news, sports events, corporate video, and weddings. Constant quality means the bitrate will change depending on the amount of detail displayed within the scene. For example, more complex frames will have a larger data range, while less complex frames will be smaller. Again, within here you have 2 quality options: Q0 and Q5. Q0 is designed for feature film and commercial work, and Q5 is designed for independent film and high-end television. Page 2 allows us to change Blackmagic's dynamic range, which are essentially their picture profiles, and you have 3 to choose from. Film is their log profile, video is their standard profile, and extended video is similar to that of Canon's YDR or Sony Cinegamma. It's a halfway house between a standard gamma and a log profile, so it has more contrast and saturation than log, but less dynamic range. We'd recommend using the film log profile for most applications. However, if you needed less dynamic range and a quick turnaround project, then extended video is useful to have. Within this page, you can also adjust the project frame rate and off-speed recording, just as you can from the toolbar on the live display. Remember, when recording slow motion, you can capture this in 2 different ways. The first method is the way I've already discussed, which is capturing at a faster frame rate and turning it into a regular frame rate directly in camera, for example 25 frames over 50 frames. This means the image will be slowed down in camera and turned into a 25 frame per second file. The second method is capturing both the project rate and capture rate at the same speed, for example 50 frames over 50 frames. This will produce normal looking footage, but it provides the ability for it to be slowed down in post-production, because it has those additional frames to work with. Even when editing on a 25 frame per second timeline, the regular 50 frames will still look normal. This is because most editing systems simply hide the additional frames until you need to use them, like when creating a speed change. Within the window, you can also choose the preferred card the camera will use for first recording to, and you can force the camera to stop capturing if any frames are dropped. This is a fantastic setting which always ensures you get the exact frame rate without any jumps. Finally, you can turn on the window sensor, which will allow higher frame rates of up to 120 frames per second. However, this will only be available if you're capturing in 1080p. In addition, when windowing the sensor, a crop will occur, so reframing may be necessary. Finally, on page 3 of the record window, we have the option to enable or disable in-camera sharpening, adding a LUT to the clip and creating an automatic time-lapse. Personally, I turn off in-camera sharpening, as many cameras tend to be quite aggressive in their noise cancellation, and generally it's optimal to perform noise reduction in post. Also, I'd always recommend having the LUT recording to a clip turned off, as baking in an adjustment provides less flexibility in post.
Within the second window tab houses our monitor preferences. From here, you can adjust and stipulate which settings are enabled and visible across the built-in LCD, an external source run through the HDMI, such as a secondary monitor, or on both. Across page 1 of the LCD and HDMI, we can enable a variety of monitoring and exposure aids, such as a display LUT, zebra levels, focus assist, frame guides, our grid overlays, a safety zone marker, or the false color chart, and we can enable a clean feed if you wish for these parameters to be permanently disabled. From page 1 of the Both tab, this is where you can set the frame guide aspect ratio and its opacity level, and it's also where you can choose the type of peaking lines available, the intensity of the peaking line, the color of the peaking, and the zebra percentage level. Across page 2 of the Both tab, you can select one of 4 grid types, these being the rule of thirds, a horizon leveler, crosshairs, or a center dot, as well as selecting the safety zone percentage and enabling an anamorphic desqueeze option if shooting with anamorphic lenses. Within page 2 of the LCD, you can choose whether the status text is on or off, you can adjust the screen brightness to help with visibility, and you can switch between displaying the audio meters or the resolution and codec. Personally, I always keep mine as meters. Page 2 of the HDMI provides similar functionality, but displays status information across an external monitor for either a cinematographer or director. Next, within the audio window and on page 1, we have the ability to set 2 microphone channels. These can be paired to one of 3 audio types. First is the internal camera microphone, in which we can record the left and right channels separately across both tracks to create a stereo setup, or alternatively, we can choose to capture the microphone across just one channel, producing a mono track. As a second option, we can choose to input an external microphone via a mini XLR, and this input is located on the side of the camera body. Due to this being a mini input, you'll need to use the supplied mini XLR jack to convert our regular XLR cables. The XLR can be set as either mic or line. If connecting directly to a microphone, choose XLR mic. The third option allows you to input audio via a 3.5mm jack, again located on the side of the camera body. This can once again be set as either a left, right, or mono channel, and can be inputted as line or mic. 3.5mm inputs are useful if you're using microphones such as the Rode Video mic. Remember, these two channels are separate, so if you want one channel to record via an XLR microphone and the second channel to record via a 3.5mm jack, you can do that. Below each channel, you have the audio levels, which present a colourful, clear and precise meter for the audio signal, and you can adjust each channel's gain, i.e. the loudness of the signal. Across page 2 of the audio tab, you can adjust the headphone volume to ensure you can monitor the microphones correctly, adjust the speaker volume for when you wish to play back and listen to clips directly in the camera, and you have the ability to enable XLR phantom power, which will send power to a microphone that doesn't have built-in batteries. An important note here is to please turn off phantom power if you're using a microphone which doesn't require it, as failing to do so can damage equipment as an electrical charge will be sent through the cable. After audio, we have the setup window. Page 1 comprises of our date, time and language, and allows us to choose whether the shutter is shown as a speed or an angle. From here, we can also choose which hertz range the flicker-free shutter is referencing. This is particularly useful for artificial lighting. The hertz range references the power source of a country, with Europe and the majority of Asia using 50 Hz and North America using 60.
Most forms of artificial lighting flicker at double the power source, so around 100 pulses of light per second in 50 Hz regions and 120 light pulses for 60 Hz. Flickering can occur in your image due to the frame rate and shutter combination choices you make when filming across these different power sources. To try and eliminate flickering in your image, you have a number of options. First, try and use a frame rate and shutter that's a dividing number of the pulse rate or as close to as possible. So in a 50 Hz region, which has 100 pulses of light per second, 25 and 50 frames per second, and 1/50 and 1/100 for your shutter are the optimal choices. If you choose to shoot in the cinematic standard of 24 frames, then ideally you'll want a shutter of 1/48. However, not all cameras have this option, at which point 1/50 is perfectly acceptable. While an image stabilization setting is visible in the setup page, this only relates to IBIS found on micro four thirds lenses. The camera doesn't have built-in image stabilization, and we're using Canon glass via the Metabones speed booster. Across page 2 of the setup window, you have the ability to adjust the 3 quick function buttons which sit beside the power dial. These can be assigned to access your most used features, and there's 2 types of function behaviors available. Preset allows you to choose dedicated values for particular functions, for example, iris at f8, ISO at 400, white balance at 5500 Kelvin. Toggle allows you to assign a specific parameter which will be displayed on the LCD, for example, false color, zebras, or focus assist. In page 3, we can adjust the camera screen brightness, alter the LED tally light, and view software and firmware versions. We also have the ability to restore the camera to its factory default and perform a pixel remap, which checks for hot pixels in the frame and attempts to remove them. When you do this, make sure to attach the lens cap, as this ensures the pixel remap is being performed across a pure black backdrop. On page 4 of the setup window lies the Bluetooth connectivity. This allows control from a variety of Apple and Android apps via a tablet and phone. Blackmagic's official controller, tentatively titled Blackmagic Camera Control, is accessible only on iPads at the time of filming. However, there are third-party options available across both platforms. For Apple, you have Bluetooth Plus for Blackmagic, and for Android, there's a Blackmagic BMPCC 4K controller. Across the Presets tab, we have the ability to save or load 12 collections of settings into the camera. These can be created for different shooting environments. You're also able to export a preset onto an SD card and import it back into the camera at a later date, ensuring your preferred settings are quickly accessible regardless of which camera you boot out. To add a preset, tap the Add icon, name the preset, and then press the Update to save settings. To load a preset from an SD card, tap Load. Update will overwrite a previously added preset and save the current settings you've selected. To export a preset to either an external hard drive via USB-C or an SD card, highlight the preset you wish to export, press Manage, then tap Export Selected Preset. Use the Delete tab to remove existing presets. Finally, the LUT panel provides correction overlays for the film log picture profile. These provide saturation and contrast, giving you an idea of what the final outputted image may look like once the clip has been color graded. These LUTs are only an overlay and will not be burned into the image. Unless of course you've enabled the Record LUT to Clip from page 3 of the record window, which I mentioned earlier, which we already recommended you should definitely have disabled. If you decide to edit in DaVinci Resolve, a LUT's information will be saved in the metadata, meaning editors and colorists have an idea of what LUT the director referenced, providing a guideline for the finished product. A hidden page is also available on the live display by swiping left or right. This brings you to a slate display where you can alter clip and project settings, which will then be accessible via metadata in DaVinci Resolve. This ranges from your scene number, reel and take, and whether the clip was an interior or exterior shot, to the project and director's name. It provides welcomed information which can help speed up your post-production workflow and aid your hard drive's media management. Finally, if you're outside in bright shooting conditions and are struggling to view the screen, the Pocket 4K also comes equipped with a sun hood, which can easily be inserted onto the pre-installed plastic holder which surrounds the display. In addition, if you get caught in the rain, we've also supplied a dedicated waterproof rain jacket which slips over the camera to protect it, while still allowing you to have full manual control. I'd recommend also taking an umbrella and even a plastic bag as a backup method if you find the rain jacket difficult to put on, or if the rain occurs very quickly and you don't have time to install it. Hopefully this has been informative and it's given you a detailed breakdown of how to set up the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. If you have any questions relating to any of the things I've discussed in this video, please don't hesitate to come and see any of the technicians in the Media Center. Until next time, keep shooting, keep being creative, and we'll see you soon.